They say the glass nail man only visits those who dare to stay awake too long. It starts with a faint scraping sound, something like fingernails dragging slowly against a window pane, soft but grating enough to send a chill down your spine. For Maria, the sound began at precisely 3:33 a.m. She had been cramming for her final exams in the dim glow of her desk lamp, the house otherwise silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. But then she heard it. At first, she thought it was just the wind brushing a tree branch against her window. But as the minutes dragged on, the scraping grew sharper, more deliberate, as though something, or someone, was testing the glass. Her fingers trembled as she pulled back the curtain, expecting to see nothing but her own pale reflection staring back. Instead, she saw him. He stood in the shadows just beyond the reach of the street lamp. His body was elongated, almost skeletal, and his face, oh God, his face, was smooth and featureless, save for a grotesque smile carved too wide into his flesh. But it wasn't his face that sent Maria stumbling back in terror. It was his hands. Long, spindly fingers ended in what looked like jagged shards of glass, glinting faintly in the moonlight. They twitched and flexed as if eager to dig into something soft. Maria's heart pounded as she backed away, her mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a prank, she thought. Maybe she was overtired and imagining things. But then came the sound again, scrape, scrape, scrape. Only this time it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the house. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't heard a door open. She hadn't heard footsteps. And yet, the glass nail man was no longer outside. Maria, the voice was low, raspy, and impossibly close. She spun around, but the room was empty. Then she saw it. Thin, shimmering scratches carving themselves into the wall, letters forming one agonizing stroke at a time. Her eyes burned as she stared at the words, refusing to look away. But she couldn't keep them open forever. When her lids finally fluttered shut for just a fraction of a second, the scraping returned. Louder, faster, more frantic. She barely had time to scream before the lights went out. Maria's scream died in her throat as the room was swallowed by darkness. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face, but she could feel the air shift, cooler, heavier, like something ancient and vile was breathing down her neck. Then came the sound again. Scrape. It was closer now, impossibly close. Scrape, scrape. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. Panic surged as she stumbled blindly in the dark, her hands flailing in search of something. Anything to protect herself. Her fingers brushed against the edge of her desk, knocking a stack of papers to the floor. The noise was deafening in the oppressive silence, but the scraping never stopped. It seemed to echo from every direction, relentless and maddening. Maria, the voice slithered into her ears, chilling her blood. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was inside her head now, slithering into the corners of her thoughts like a serpent. You stayed awake too long. You broke the rules. What rules? She choked out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only a soft, wet drip that joined the symphony of scraping. She turned her head toward the sound, her pulse hammering in her ears. The faint metallic tang in the air hit her a moment later. Blood. Whose blood? She whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. A faint glow flickered to life behind her, casting her shadow long and jagged across the walls. She turned slowly, her stomach knotting with dread. The glass nail man was crouched in the corner of the room, his elongated limbs folding unnaturally like a spider. His glass nails gleamed in the dim light, coated in crimson droplets that slid down and pooled on the floor beneath him. His eyeless face tilted to one side as though studying her, the grotesque smile stretching wider, impossibly wide. Maria tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. "Do you know what happens to those who don't sleep?" he asked, his voice like shattered glass grinding against bone. She shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They see too much, and when they see too much," he extended one of his spindly arms, the glass nails clicking together as he dragged them across the floor toward her. "I have to take their eyes." Maria's back hit the wall, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. "No, please. I didn't mean to." But the glass nail man wasn't listening. His nails scraped against her bare skin, cold and sharp, drawing thin lines of blood as he trailed them along her arm. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron, unyielding. "Shoo," he whispered, his smile so close now that she could feel the icy chill radiating from it. "Don't fight. It'll hurt more if you fight." Her hand found the heavy glass paperweight on her desk, and without thinking, she swung it with all her strength. It connected with a sickening crunch, shattering the side of his smooth, featureless head. The glass nail man staggered back, a low growl rumbling from his throat. Maria didn't wait to see what he'd do next. She bolted for the door, her bare feet slipping in the blood that now coated the floor. She reached the hallway, her fingers fumbling for the light switch, but it wouldn't turn on. Behind her, the scraping grew louder, faster, more chaotic. She could hear his long limbs dragging against the walls as he chased her, his nails carving jagged lines into the wood. She sprinted down the stairs, nearly tumbling in her desperation. Her mind raced. She couldn't stay in the house. She had to get outside, find anyone who could help. But when she reached the front door, she froze. The door was gone. In its place was a wall, solid, unbroken, as though the door had never been there at all. "No, no, no," she sobbed, pounding her fists against the wall. Behind her, the scraping stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The glass nail man stood at the bottom of the stairs, his twisted body blocking her only escape route. His smile was wider than ever, splitting his face nearly in two. "You can't run," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "You stayed awake too long, Maria. And now you're mine." Maria's back pressed against the wall where the door had once been. Her fingers dug into the unyielding plaster as she trembled, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. The glass nail man didn't move. He stood at the base of the stairs, his grotesquely elongated limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his featureless face tilted in mock curiosity. The smile carved into his flesh was so wide it seemed ready to split his head in half. Maria's eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. The glass paperweight had bought her a few precious seconds before, but now it was upstairs, far out of reach. There was nothing left. "I didn't mean to," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "I didn't mean to stay awake. I was just studying. Please." His smile stretched wider, the jagged edges of his teeth glinting faintly in the dim light. "You broke the rules, Maria. You invited me in." "I didn't invite you," she screamed, her voice raw with panic. "You did," he hissed, taking one slow, deliberate step toward her. The sound of his glass nails dragging across the wooden floor made her knees buckle. "You ignored the signs, the whispers, the warnings. You stayed awake. And now you'll never sleep again." Her mind raced, fragments of memory bubbling to the surface. The warnings her grandmother used to tell her, old superstitions she'd dismissed as nonsense. "Never ignore the scratching, Maria. If you hear it, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and sleep. If you don't, he'll find you." And once he's inside, Maria swallowed hard, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind. She didn't dare finish the thought. "I can fix it," she stammered, backing away as the glass nail man took another step forward. "I can sleep now, see? I'll sleep right now. Just leave me alone." He laughed, the sound sharp and grating, like shards of glass tumbling down a metal chute. "Too late. You can't unsee me, Maria. You can't unherd me. You're mine now." Desperation clawed at her throat. Her eyes darted to the staircase, the only path left to her. If she could just make it to her room, lock the door, and find anything to fight him off. Before she could second-guess herself, she bolted. The glass nail man's head snapped toward her, his long limbs unfolding as he lunged forward. His nails scraped across the floor, sending sparks flying as he missed her by mere inches. Maria's feet barely touched the steps as she scrambled up the stairs, her hands gripping the banister, so tightly her knuckles turned white. Behind her, she could hear him climbing, his movements unnervingly fast and inhuman, like a spider scuttling after its prey. When she reached her bedroom, she slammed the door shut and threw herself against it, fumbling for the lock. Her fingers finally found it, twisting it into place just as the first impact shook the door. Bang! The force nearly knocked her forward. Scrape! His nails dragged down the wood, leaving deep gouges in their wake. Maria stumbled back, her chest heaving. Her eyes darted around the room. The glass paperweight was still on her desk, bloodied from her earlier strike. She grabbed it with trembling hands, her pulse pounding in her ears. Maria, his voice seeped through the cracks in the door, low and mocking. Do you really think a locked door will stop me? She didn't answer, her breath catching as she pressed her back against the far wall. The scraping stopped. Silence. It was worse than the noise. Her ears strained against the quiet, every second stretching into an eternity. She clutched the paperweight tighter, her fingers slick with sweat. Then came the whisper, soft and cruel. Behind you. Her blood turned to ice. She whirled around, swinging the paperweight blindly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty corner of her room, the shadows deep and impenetrable. A sharp pain tore through her shoulder, and she screamed, dropping the paperweight. The glass nail man was there, his jagged nails glinting in the faint light as he dragged one slowly down her arm, slicing through skin and muscle with terrifying ease. Blood seeped from the wound, pulling on the floor. You can't run from me, he said, his voice thick with malice. You're my Maria, body and soul. She swung at him with her fists, but it was like striking smoke. He was insubstantial, his body flickering like a broken image. His nails, however, were horrifyingly real. Maria's vision blurred as the pain overwhelmed her. She stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. As she hit the floor, her hand brushed against something cold and sharp, the shard of glass from her broken window. Her fingers closed around it. The glass nail man loomed over her, his smile widening as he raised one clawed hand. Say goodbye, Maria. With the last of her strength, she drove the glass shard into his chest. For a moment, everything froze. His smile faltered, his head jerking back in shock. Then, with a sound like shattering mirrors, his body cracked and splintered, light pouring from the fractures. Maria scrambled back as his form collapsed inward, his screams echoing in her ears. The room filled with a blinding white light, forcing her to shield her eyes. When the light faded, he was gone. The room was silent again, save for the sound of her ragged breathing. Blood dripped from her wounds, staining the floor, but she didn't care. She was alive, but as she stared at the shattered glass shard in her hand, a chill ran down her spine. Because faintly, in the quiet, she could still hear it. Scrape. Maria sat in the corner of her room, clutching the shard of glass so tightly that her bloodied fingers trembled. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her eyes darted around the room. She wanted to believe it was over, that her desperate act had somehow vanquished the nightmare. But the faint sound, the scrape, lingered. It was distant now, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Her heart sank as she realized the truth. The glass nail man wasn't gone. He was waiting. Why won't you leave me alone? She whispered, her voice cracking. The room responded with silence. She staggered to her feet, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Blood oozed from the gash on her arm, leaving a trail as she stumbled toward the bathroom. She had to stop the bleeding, think clearly, figure out a way to end this once and for all. The hallway felt impossibly long, each step echoing like a gunshot in the quiet house. The shadows seemed to stretch and move, playing tricks on her already fragile mind. When she finally reached the bathroom, she flicked on the light and locked the door behind her. The mirror reflected a version of herself she barely recognized. Pale, wide-eyed, streaked with blood and tears. Her trembling hands fumbled with the first aid kit as she pressed gauze against the wound on her arm. The sting was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the terror coursing through her veins. As she worked, something in the corner of the mirror caught her eye. A flicker, a movement. No, she whispered, refusing to look. Her hands worked faster, her breath quickening. but the flicker grew more pronounced. The corner of the bathroom darkened, the light overhead dimming, as if the room itself was being swallowed by something unseen. And then she heard it again. Scrape. This time it wasn't faint. It was loud, deliberate, and coming from behind her. Maria whirled around, clutching the shard of glass like a lifeline. The bathroom was empty. The door was still locked. Her eyes darted to the mirror. He was there. The glass nail man stood in the reflection, his smile wider than ever, his nails dragging slowly across the glass. But when Maria turned to face him, the room was still empty. "Stop it!" she screamed, slamming her fist against the mirror. The glass cracked, fracturing his image into dozens of distorted, grinning fragments. His voice slithered into her ears, low and mocking. "You can't hide from me, Maria. I'm everywhere now. In the glass, in the shadows, in you." "No," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You're lying. You can't have me." He laughed, the sound echoing through the small bathroom. "Oh, Maria, you let me at the moment you stayed awake too long. And now, I'm a part of you. Every reflection, every shadow. Every time you close your eyes, I'll be there." Maria shook her head violently, backing away until her back hit the cold tile wall. Her breathing was ragged, her vision blurring as panic took hold. "There has to be a way to stop this. There has to be." His grin widened, his jagged nails pressing against the inside of the mirror as though testing its strength. "There's only one way." She froze. "What is it?" The mirror began to vibrate, the cracks spreading like veins. "You have to break the cycle," he whispered. "You have to give me someone else." Maria's stomach turned. "What?" "Invite someone in," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Tell them my story. Make them listen. Make them believe. And when they stay awake too long, I'll visit them instead." "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I won't do that. I won't hurt anyone else." His laugh was a low, rumbling growl. "Then I'll stay with you forever, Maria. I'll carve my way into your mind, into your soul. You'll never sleep again. And when your body gives out, when you finally break, I'll drag you down into the dark where you'll stay forever." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her head in her hands. The weight of his words crushed her. Could she really sacrifice someone else to save herself? Could she live with the guilt? The scraping grew louder, more insistent. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her mind raced through the faces of people she knew, friends, acquaintances, anyone she could call. Anyone she could? "No," she screamed, slamming the shard of glass into the mirror. It shattered completely, the fragments exploding outward and cutting into her skin. The reflection of the glass nail man dissolved into 1,000 tiny pieces. But his laughter remained. "You can't destroy me, Maria. I told you, I'm everywhere." The laughter faded, leaving her alone in the destroyed bathroom. Her reflection was gone, replaced by shards of herself scattered across the floor. She stumbled to her feet, clutching the door frame for support. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel safe. It never would. Maria walked to the window, staring out at the empty street. Her eyes were hollow, her hands trembling. Somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't over. And then, faintly, from the glass shards on the floor, she heard it one last time. "Scrape."